A little bit more about, for example, water is the main element of pacification, and then in a way it's being guaranteed to the Palestinian people to pacify, but then the state takes the full control. I would like to hear a little bit more about that. So Palestinians have no access to water other than through the authorities. So how does it work? If you're a Palestinian, how do you get the water? You said, I would like to hear a little more. And about your presentation, I was thinking of the dramatically increasing role of Canada in extractivism throughout Latin America, in which Canada is the leading power there. And so, how do these two things relate? Because it seems, at least in South America, we used to have an image of Canada being so friendly and civilized and European, and then Canada gets this extractivist phase. So you're talking about this infrastructure phase, extractivism. When did this whole thing start, and how the domestic pacification strategy and colonialism relate to this expansion in international trade?
So I have a question for Tia. I was wondering on the last document you mentioned, if you could speak a little to its formation, like the public-private partnerships, and really I'm wondering about the relative autonomy of the police and the degree of capital influence on policy formation, and how this police intelligence report looks like an economic planning document. Is this something that the police have internalized? Is this something that they're producing in conjunction with, private capital interests? How that plays out? Thanks.
So I didn't have really time, I wasn't really able to kind of go how it works, but Palestinians at the moment have access to, under the Oslo Agreement, which was negotiated 94-95 between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, they have access to a number of wells that they already have locally that they abstract from aquifer underground water. And the amount that they're able to abstract is also restricted and is allocated under this agreement. So essentially, they're left out with no other alternative than water from Israel, which Israel, sometimes it's water there's an Israeli private company. This is the public-private enterprise I was referring to that is common. So the Israeli Mekorot company is selling sometimes water that is abstracted locally sometimes, and sometimes on a larger scale, Israel sells to the Palestinian Authority desalinated water or other water that it has. So there's actually one national carrier that merges desalinated water with natural water. So Israel is selling that. But a point I wanted to make is about, so for example, in this context of Israel is selling, this is not an exchange in a kind of strictly capitalist sense. And this difference is important, I find, because Israel, for example, in this context, is not even selling, it's allocating, it's providing with the same infrastructure, like it's all one grid, the water allocation to Palestinians, and then deducts the money from tax money that it owes to Palestinian Authority. So the important difference here is that this is occupation, and Palestine doesn't have any room to kind of maneuver within that. And that's a point I wanted to make about pacification more broadly, because I think my application to this case study in the sense of occupation is pushing on some of the limits of pacification theory, because it doesn't quite so neatly fit into a capitalist logic. So the arbitrariness of the occupation, the livelihoods, the realities that Palestinians live under, doesn't always just facilitate capital accumulation. It's just illogical, because in a way that is the policy, that you have no normal under occupation. And this is something that an interviewee has said to me recently, quite like that. It's not just any old capitalism, it's occupation. And it makes me think also about the colonial context, because I think we can apply, of course, there is these relations, right? It is a continuity, and it's important, coming back to the discussion yesterday with Ben and Mark, I think it is important to remember that this is not new. These policies of clearing out the lands and taking control and policing the space have been, that is the history, the colonial history is precisely that. There's some scholars, for example, of the third wall approaches to international law, TWAIL, such as John Reynolds, for example, who elaborates exactly that. So I think it is important to kind of see the links, but also see where perhaps it doesn't quite fit, and perhaps occupation is more like colonialism in this sense. So, thank you.
Because my work is largely focused on Canadian law enforcement and intelligence agencies, I mean, they generally don't have any jurisdiction, right? But of course, Canada does have a major role. I think Canada's laws around or regulatory frameworks for mining companies is so, it's ridiculous. I mean, and so that's why we have so many companies registering in Canada and doing things around the world. So I think there's been some moves recently. I mean, there's been the creation of a new oversight agency. Who knows what that's going to do? But yeah, I mean, I think Canada's this sort of renewed discourse around extractivism, this push both in the actual, like the formal economic policy and in the national security context, is being driven by this language of wanting to develop a greater self-reliance on Canada's own resources, particularly in the tar sands in Alberta. And in particular, a concern about the relationship with the U.S. and not having trade just, not being reliant on that trade to the U.S. and opening up, say, other markets. So I can't offer much in that sense, but of course, I mean, there is always going to be interconnected. And so I know there are some analyses out there, right, that see Canadian companies' presence as a form of imperialism, right? Like, where are the profits? Where are they ending up and such? So the question around public-private partnerships, yeah, I could speak a lot about this. There's both formal and informal channels. There's been the opening up of online platforms. Industry representatives have security clearances that let them get intelligence from various agencies. What else is happening? They have these sector-specific networks, and they meet twice a year. So the energy and utilities is the most well-developed one, which is not surprising. There's been more direct collaboration in terms of producing intelligence products. So we do have, through, again, freedom of information, we've acquired documents that show specific companies meeting with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to develop an intelligence gathering plan. And then, other documents are where they're looking at this kind of they're making these strategic assessments about the petroleum industry's opposition to pipeline expansion. And those are drawing primarily on industry sources for their assessment, right? So it's not surprising that the way they frame the problem, right, is from an industry perspective. And this is something that there's like the priority is still to deepen those relationships. So people are being like they're being placed within the agencies. There's, I mean, from some sectors, there's still a bit of resistance to that because, I mean, the interests of these corporations are not necessarily always going to be compatible, right, with the security interests of the state. So one of the major concerns, and maybe thinking strategically, you know, something that could be disrupted or intervened in, is the concern by companies because they're expected to share information in a room with their competitors. Right, so you know there's hesitancy to sort of to share information about their infrastructures and risks because then they're sort of sharing their proprietary sort of information. So I think it's things like that think more about in terms of the financial dimension. I don't know. So yes, lots of very deep and direct interaction between these agencies and industry.
Just one very small thing. I don't know, but I think it's an issue that would be interesting for future research about Israel, Palestine, and what. It is about, and it's something very interesting in this land here. Bhriain 1 and 2, just in front of the Gaza Strip, are two big deposits of natural gas. In the Oslo agreements, they were given to the future Israel-Palestine state in order to have material assets on which they should found their financial capability as a state. After Rabin was killed, the Oslo Agreement was destroyed, and the 35 miles of sea that Gaza had in front of itself were restricted year after year. When Hamas won the election, it was cut by half. And when there was the big Israel operation called Lead Store, maybe, they were reduced to 3 miles. The Gaza fishermen were forbidden to get with professional boats beyond the 3 miles. And Israel Marine started shooting against them, killed quite a lot of them. Now, there is a project which is still very theoretical that sees a gas line coming from those waters, crossing Cyprus, and coming just to cross the theoretical gas line. There is a research that was sponsored by the Palestine Authority about 10 years ago, but no stone afterwards got inside that deep. So, Mia, thank you very much for what you did, and excuse me for the suggestion.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, just thank you. I don't think there's much to add there. Thank you for pointing that out, and I think that this is precisely what I was referring to, this kind of de-development policy on the one hand that kind of captures, the fisherman story, the fishing story is a huge one along the Gaza Strip. Again, it's just stripping livelihoods of Palestinians, the little that they have left. But of course, it's also heavily policed, it's heavily militarized zones that whenever there is eruptions, as we've seen even with more recent events, is responded with heavy military response, and of course considered in Israel a security issue, a matter of security, of national security of citizens. So thank you for that.